So I want you to picture a massive trade caravan just moving slowly through the Arabian Peninsula in the early 7th century.
Right. The classic historical image.
Exactly. But it's not just a few merchants, you know? You have hundreds of camels, vast wealth, and these merchants are effectively the geopolitical power brokers of their time.
They're running the primary trade route, right, between
Yeah.
Yemen down south and the Byzantine territories up north in Syria.
Yeah, exactly. And a day after day, as these traders trace that route, they're literally walking past the colossal, wind-scoured stone ruins of Madain Salah.
Oh, wow.
They're looking at the shattered, monumental architecture of the Thamud, and further along, the remnants of the A'ad. And the thing is, these weren't mythological bedtime stories to the Meccan traders.
No, not at all.
They were walking past the physical, decaying corpses of dead superpowers.
And that tangible physical reality, I mean, that is the entire foundation of what we are unpacking in our deep dive today. Those merchants didn't see those ruins as fairy tales. They saw them as sobering, undeniable evidence of past economic and structural might that somehow, despite all this wealth and engineering prowess, just completely collapsed.
Which brings us to the core of this deep dive. We are jumping straight into a very specific set of sources today, which are Allama Parvez's extensive and highly analytical lectures on the opening verses of Surah Sad.
Specifically verses 1 through 8, right?
Right. And our mission here is to understand how Parvez completely upends the traditional way this ancient text is read. Because, you know, the conventional approach tends to wrap these verses in this heavy, heavy mysticism.
It frames them as a series of theological demands requiring blind faith.
Exactly. But Parvez strips all of that away. He argues that we are not looking at a mystical incantation at all. Instead, we have a stark, empirical, sociological blueprint.
A structural blueprint.
Yeah. His claim is that the text functions almost like an autopsy report of those dead superpowers in the desert, you know? Laying out the rational, observable laws of why civilizations rise and why they inevitably collapse.
And the shift in perspective he demands there is just monumental.
Right.
I mean, Parvez insists that the text refuses to be cordoned off into this separate ethereal category of religion.
Right, disconnected from reality.
Disconnected from the cold realities of economics, sociology, and political power. It essentially asserts that human societies are governed by immutable systemic laws.
Just like physics.
Exactly like physics or biology.
Hmm.
If you construct a society on exploitative principles, it will structurally fail. Period.
Okay, but you bring up the word immutable, and my immediate friction with this interpretation starts with literally the very first syllable of the chapter.
The letter sad.
Yes, the Arabic letter sad, which just sits all by itself at the beginning of the text, because for centuries, mainstream interpretation has treated these isolated letters, the muqatta'at, as, well, as impenetrable divine codes.
Right. The prevailing narrative is that humans simply do not have the clearance to understand them.
Exactly. So if the text is meant to be a clear, rational, sociological blueprint, starting it with a mystical cipher seems entirely contradictory. I mean, why start an autopsy report with a magic word?
Well, that contradiction only exists if you accept the premise that the letter actually is a cipher.
Okay.
Parvez challenges that fundamental assumption by grounding his analysis in classical pre-Islamic Arabic linguistics.
Interesting.
Yeah, using a single letter as a shorthand abbreviation was actually a standard, highly recognized literary device among the Arabs of that era.
Wait, really? Like an acronym?
Basically, yes. When a concept was deeply embedded in the culture, poets and orators would frequently just drop the first letter to signify the whole word or phrase.
Okay, so it functions like a modern acronym.
Exactly. I mean, you don't look at a legal document that says TBD and assume it's a magical spell.
Right. You recognize it as a structural shorthand.
So Parvez argues that sad represents a massive, well-understood concept regarding truth, verifiable reality, and the necessity of aligning human systems with universal laws.
Okay, I understand the linguistic parallel to modern acronyms, but an acronym only works if the audience actually knows what it stands for.
Right.
If the original audience understood SAD as a concrete instruction about verifiable reality, you have to explain how an entire civilization subsequently lost the plot and turned a basic abbreviation into a mystical puzzle.
Well, the shift from a clear linguistic shorthand to a mystical cipher,
Yep.
I mean, that didn't happen overnight. It was a result of a centuries-long cultural and, honestly, political transformation.
How so?
Because as the original highly specific Meccan dialect blended with the languages of the conquered territories across the Persian and Byzantine empires, the organic understanding of those classical Arabic idioms began to fade.
Ah, so language drift.
Language drift, but also, as later political empires consolidated power, like the Umayyads and the Abbasids, there was a huge vested interest in moving the focus of the text away from radical socioeconomic reform.
And towards safe, abstract theology.
Exactly. Mystifying the text serves the status quo. I mean, think about it. If sad is an instruction to dismantle exploitative economics, well, that's dangerous to a king.
Right.
But if it's just a mysterious secret known only to the divine, it requires no action from the ruling class. They can just revere it and move on.
Oh, wow. That political angle makes the linguistic argument much more compelling. And this empirical framing, it continues into the very next word of the text. It reads, wal Quran.
Yes, the wa,
Right. Conventionally, the wa here is translated as a simple conjunction, meaning and or it's interpreted as an oath, as in I swear by the Quran.
which pulls us right back into mysticism.
Exactly. An oath immediately pulls us back into the realm of the supernatural, demanding belief based on a sworn statement. But Parwez argues for a completely different translation.
He argues that the structural context demands we read the wa as a particle of testimony or evidence. It's known in Arabic grammar as the law of Qasam, but he understands it rationally rather than magically.
So not a plea for blind belief.
Not at all. It is a declarative epistemological claim. The text is literally stating, the Quran itself, with its focus on universal laws, is the testimony.
It's pointing the listener toward verifiable evidence.
Right. The text essentially states that the proof of its socioeconomic model can be found by simply observing human history and the physical world.
And that brings us right back to the ruins in the desert. The text points to the Thamud and the Arad and says, look at what happened.
Yes.
But I have to push back hard on this. The idea that pointing at history is the same thing as providing an empirical blueprint. I mean, anyone can point to an old ruined building and retrofit a historical narrative to match their political agenda.
Sure, people do that all the time.
Right. An observer can look at the Roman Colosseum and conclude that Rome fell because the gods were angry, or because they drank from lead pipes, or because they didn't expand fast enough. Using history as a prop doesn't automatically make your analysis scientifically valid.
That is a very fair point. But the distinction lies entirely in the mechanism of failure that Parwez identifies. If a text simply says, they were wicked, so a lightning bolt struck them, well, then you were dealing with mythology.
Right, arbitrary variable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The retrofitting you mentioned relies on arbitrary variables. But Parwez extracts a highly specific, observable socioeconomic pathology from this text.
Okay.
The argument is not that these civilizations fell due to arbitrary supernatural anger. They fell because they violated the structural laws of human equity.
Let's test that autopsy report analogy then. Because an autopsy of a failed state requires hard data. It requires showing the corrupted supply lines, the unsustainable wealth inequality, the fracturing of internal infrastructure.
And needs a mechanical cause of death.
Right. A myth tells you the sea god got angry because you didn't sacrifice a goat. The sea god is outside the realm of human action. But an autopsy says the society suffered a fatal structural heart attack because it failed to distribute resources.
And Parwez claims the text operates exactly as the latter. It identifies a specific law of societal death. He calls it the period of respite.
The period of respite, what is that functionally?
So the Arabic term is molat. Parwez notes that the text systematically rejects the catastrophic, instantaneous Hollywood version of civilizational collapse.
So no sudden fire and brimstone.
No. Societies with massive infrastructure, wealth, and armies, they do not just wake up on a random morning in perfect health and shatter into dust by dinner time.
Right.
The mechanism of collapse is a gradual, highly predictable trajectory of decline. This decline is initiated when a society structures itself around exploitation, imbalance, and the hoarding of resources.
Basically actively ignoring rational, life-sustaining laws.
Exactly. But the consequence of that structural flaw is not immediate annihilation. The universe operates on a delay. It grants a buffer zone, a window of time where the society continues to function, seemingly prosperous despite the rot in the foundation. That is the molat.
A delay between action and consequence. I mean, that makes sense on a micro level. Like, if I eat a terrible diet, I don't suffer a heart attack the next day.
Right. It takes decades of compounding damage.
But when we apply that to a macro socioeconomic structure, the delay itself is often used by the ruling class as proof that their system works.
Yes. That is the critical issue.
Because if an empire is exploiting its labor force and extracting wealth aggressively, the immediate result is usually an economic boom. The elites look at the short-term profits during this period of respite and conclude that their exploitative methods are actually the secret to their success.
And that false conclusion is the defining tragedy of the Mullah. During this buffer period, the society is not operating in a vacuum. It receives constant systemic friction.
Warning signs.
Yes, and these aren't mystical warnings. They're tangible indicators. You see widening wealth gaps, localized social unrest, ecological degradation, the erosion of the middle class, the corruption of the
Yeah,
judiciary.
that classic red flags.
They are natural alarms signaling that the socio-economic operating system is mathematically unsustainable. The delay exists to provide the society with the opportunity to observe the data, recognize the fundamental flaw, and course correct before the damage becomes irreversible.
Let's frame this within a modern context to see how the mechanism actually holds up for you listening at home. Think of a massive legacy corporation that just dominates its industry.
Okay, good analogy.
The executives make a strategic decision to prioritize aggressive short-term stock buybacks while completely gutting their research and development department. Now, they don't go bankrupt the day they sign that directive.
No, they enter their period of respite.
Exactly. For the next 5 to 10 years, their profit margins might actually look phenomenal on paper because they slashed their R&D overhead. But the market is slowly shifting. Smaller competitors are innovating.
The systemic warnings are glaringly obvious in the shifting consumer data.
Right. But the executives ignore them because their immediate quarterly bonuses depend on the current flawed structure. They refuse to restructure until they hit the mathematical tipping point where their product is obsolete.
And by then, it's too late.
Exactly. On the day they finally file for bankruptcy, panic sets in. Suddenly, they want to hold emergency town halls and pivot the business model.
And the text is brutally clear about what happens on that day. Once the tipping point is reached, once the internal decay outpaces the structural integrity of the society, the period of respite expires.
The Molat is over.
It's over. At that moment, no amount of sudden panic, no desperate last-minute policy changes, and no cries for help will reverse the momentum.
Wow.
The time for systemic reform was during the period of comfort, when the society still had the resources and stability to absorb the shock of restructuring. When the consequences finally manifest, the laws of cause and effect are firmly locked in.
Parwaz actually brings in a fascinating piece of literature to illustrate the psychology behind why humans consistently fail this test. And he references a Hindi couplet, a doha, rather than quoting an Arabic source, which I think shows how universally he views this sociological law.
The doha perfectly captures the psychological blindness inherent in entrenched power. The translation points out this bitter irony. It says, in times of deep suffering, everyone remembers the higher principles, the need for equity, the universal laws of justice.
Right. When things fall apart, everyone gets religious or ethical.
But in times of comfort and prosperity, no one pays attention to those laws. The couplet concludes by asking, if one were to integrate and remember those higher principles during the times of comfort, why would the suffering ever arrive in the first place?
It's a profound distillation of the Molat.
It really is. If a society uses its period of stability to implement equitable, rational laws, it immunizes itself against collapse.
Okay, the couplet describes human nature beautifully, but the text isn't just addressing human nature in a vacuum, right? It is addressing a highly specific, organized opposition.
Yes, the 7th century elites of Mecca.
The Sardars of the Quraysh tribe. They were the ones living in that period of comfort. So what exactly were they so stubbornly refusing to fix? I mean, if the data of the Malat was ticking down and the ruins of the Thamud were right there in the desert as a visual aid, why couldn't these highly intelligent, successful merchants simply look at the socioeconomic indicators and reform their system?
Well, they refused, because reform wasn't just a matter of tweaking a few policy. It required dismantling the entire apparatus that gave them their wealth and power in the first place.
Right, always about the money.
Always. Parwaz argues that the defining characteristic of a society hurtling toward collapse is a fragmented, exploitative power structure. The Meccan elites weren't making innocent administrative errors. They had constructed an incredibly lucrative system of inequality, and they were actively, desperately defending it against the alternative model proposed by the text.
This actually brings us to the structural critique of polytheism, which is perhaps Parwez's most radical reframing of the historical narrative.
Absolutely.
Because when you read standard histories of the conflict between the messenger and the Meccan elites, it is universally presented as a theological debate about statues.
Right, the narrative goes that the elites were deeply emotionally attached to their 360 stone idols in the Kaaba.
And they were just personally offended when someone suggested invisible monotheism instead. But Parwez rejects this entirely. He claims the conflict had absolutely nothing to do with religious sentimentality.
No, it was a clash over divided loyalties, bureaucratic corruption, and absolute economic control.
Okay, unpack that for us, because to understand Parwez or critique, you have to understand the actual mechanics of 7th century Meccan economics, right?
Yes. The Kaaba wasn't just a spiritual center. It was effectively the Wall Street of the Arabian Peninsula.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
By housing 360 different idols representing the various tribes of the region, the Quraysh elites established a decentralized franchise model of wealth extraction.
Wow, a franchise model.
Think about it. Every tribe that came to worship their specific idol had to trade in the Meccan markets, pay tariffs, and offer tribute. So polytheism in this context was not a mystical belief system. Parwez literally defines it as a bureaucracy of gods.
A bureaucracy of gods. That phrase completely changes the perspective, because a bureaucracy implies a massive, complex network of administration designed to manage and control. How does a fragmented belief system function as a tool for economic control on the ground for the average citizen?
It functions by creating endless layers of dependency. When you have dozens of different deities responsible for different domains of life, you allow human elites to install themselves as the necessary intermediaries for every single transaction.
The gatekeepers.
Exactly. The text refers to these intermediaries as local lords, or kudawandan. You have one priestly class managing the god of agriculture, another managing the god of trade, another for health, another for war.
Right.
The average citizen cannot simply exist and thrive. They must constantly navigate this labyrinth, paying tolls to the human gatekeepers who guard the divine favors.
Parwez uses a modern analogy that just clarifies the sheer administrative misery of this system. He likens the polytheistic structure to a deeply corrupt contemporary bureaucratic government.
Yeah, the permit analogy.
Right. If you are a citizen trying to start a business, you can't just operate freely. You want an import license. You have to find the specific official in the Commerce Department and pay the bribe.
You need a security permit.
You have to go to a different building, find the police chief and pay a different bribe. You need medical clearance. Find the health inspector and pay him.
It's exhausting.
Every god in the Meccan system represented a different department of the socio-economic structure, and every department was controlled by a sardar extracting a tax.
It was essentially an extensive protection racket disguised as sacred tradition. So, when the text introduces the concept of Tawhid, Parwez argues it is not merely advocating for the existence of one invisible deity.
Right.
It is proposing a singular, unified, rational law that applies equally to every single human being without exception. It is the proposition of a flat, transparent, socio-economic structure.
But the moment you propose a unified system where the law applies equally to the elite and the peasant, you are engaging in theology. You are declaring a systemic revolution.
Absolutely.
You are telling the guy who controls the agricultural idol that his job is obsolete. You are telling the tribe that taxes the trade routes that their authority is null and void.
Which is exactly why the elites reacted with such extreme hostility. They didn't hear a philosophical argument. They saw a massive political conspiracy designed to bankrupt them.
Of course.
If a single universal law is established, the entire bureaucracy of gatekeepers collapses. The priests lose their income streams, the tribal leaders lose their leverage over the populace.
The politicians lose the ability to divide and conquer the lower classes by pitting the followers of one idol against another.
Right. The accusation they leveled against the messenger was that he was merely trying to overthrow the existing socio-economic order to seize absolute power for himself. And Parwez connects this directly to the Quranic narrative of Pharaoh and Moses.
That's a vital connection because Pharaoh's reaction to Moses is almost always depicted as a clash of magic, right? Like Moses has a staff that turns into a snake, Pharaoh has a sorcerer.
The Hollywood version.
Exactly. But Parwez looks at the structural dialogue.
Yes, when you read the actual dialogue in the text, Pharaoh's concern is not theological at all. He addresses his inner circle and says, This man wants to drive you out of your land.
Oh, wow.
Pharaoh is terrified that Moses is going to uproot his exploitative slave labor system and fundamentally alter the political landscape of Egypt. The Meccan elites had the exact same fear regarding the unified system.
But here's the thing. The Meccan elites couldn't just stand up in the town square and say, "Hey everyone, we reject this unified system because it stops us from extorting the poor and skimming profits off the trade routes."
Right. That is terrible public relations.
The general population would turn on them instantly. So how does an entrenched elite dismiss a rational, equitable system without admitting their own corruption?
Well, they rely on one of the most powerful psychological tools of control available to the ruling class. The ancestor's fallacy, which the text refers to as Aslav.
Okay, how does that work?
Instead of debating the logical merits of the new unified system, the elites simply point backward in time. They argue that the proposed system must be a lie, a dangerous fabrication, simply because their glorious historical forefathers never mentioned it.
They invoke sacred tradition as a shield against reform. It's an incredibly effective strategy because it bypasses logic and appeals directly to identity and emotion.
It's very manipulative.
But Parwez levels a biting critique against this blind adherence to tradition, pointing out the inherent hypocrisy in how societies treat their reformers versus their ancestors.
The hypocrisy is entirely structural. Parwez points out that when a visionary leader or a reformer is actually alive and proposing structural changes, they are heavily persecuted, mocked, or dismissed as a madman by the authorities.
Right.
But the very moment that reformer dies, the power structure executes a brilliant pivot. They suddenly elevate the dead reformer to the status of a flawless, infallible ancestor.
They sanitize the legacy.
Exactly. They strip away all the radical economic critiques, freeze the historical figure in amber, and then weaponize that newly created mythology to prevent any future progress.
The elites basically use the reverence for the dead to enforce absolute obedience among the living. They tell the populace, "You cannot change the system because this is how the sacred ancestors built it."
Conveniently omitting the fact that the ancestor system is precisely what is causing the current wealth disparity and societal decay.
We see this constantly in modern politics. A deeply radical historical figure who fought against the institutions of their time dies. And a century later, those same institutions build a marble statue of them and invoke their name to justify the most regressive, entrenched policies imaginable.
It is a foolproof method for halting momentum. However, in the context of the text, the elites were dealing with a reformer who is still alive and actively dismantling their economic arguments.
So the ancestors' fallacy wasn't enough.
Right, it wasn't enough to stop the spread of the rational model. Because they couldn't successfully attack the logic of the single system, since equity and justice appeal naturally to the working class, they had to shift their strategy.
What did they do?
They moved from attacking the message to attacking the nature of the messenger. They demanded that he be something entirely impossible.
Okay, this transitions us into what Parwez considers the absolute necessity of the human prototype, the Bashar. Because the elite's primary recorded objection to the messenger wasn't an accusation of poor character or criminal behavior.
No, not at all.
Their objection was fundamentally about his biology. They asked, why is he just a normal guy? Why does he walk in the market and buy his own food? Why does he have a wife and children?
They wanted a superhero.
Yeah. The argument they presented was that if he were truly bringing a message of universal law from the divine order, he shouldn't be constrained by physics. He should be an angel, or at the very least, accompanied by a visible angelic army.
And on a surface level, that demand sounds like a simple request for verification. Like they are asking for a magic trick to validate his authority.
Right.
But Parwez uncovers a deeply cynical, highly calculated socio-economic motive behind the specific demand. You have to ask yourself, why do the elites desperately want the reformer to be an angel?
Well, because an angel fundamentally breaks the model of replicability. I mean, if a glowing being made of light, a creature that doesn't require sleep, doesn't need to eat, doesn't feel physical pain, and has no biological desires, comes down and hands over a blueprint for an equitable society,
What happened?
the average human citizen has an immediate, undeniable excuse. They can look at the blueprint and say, that system looks beautiful on paper. It's flawless, but it only works for an angel.
Exactly.
It is physically impossible for us mere mortals to implement it. We get tired, we get scared, we are prone to greed, and we have to feed our families. You cannot hold a biological human to the standard of a supernatural entity.
That was exactly the point. Demanding a superhuman messenger is the ultimate escape hatch for a society that refuses to change. It is a built-in, unassailable excuse to avoid the grueling work of actually implementing the law.
Oh.
Parwes argues vehemently that for any constitution or socio-economic model to be proven viable and practical for humanity, it must be executed by a biological, flawed, standard human being.
Yeah.
The Quranic term is bashar.
A human prototype.
Yes. The leader must be someone who experiences genuine hunger. They must be someone who can be wounded and bleed on a battlefield. They must face devastating political defeats, endure sickness, and eventually die.
Because it is the ultimate proof of concept. If the model isn't replicable by a normal human, it isn't a socio-economic model, it's a fantasy novel.
Right.
Think of a modern parallel. Imagine you decide to radically change your health, and a fitness guru approaches you with a rigorous workout and diet plan. They promise it will transform your physical capabilities.
Sounds great.
You're skeptical, so you ask for proof. But instead of showing you the results of hard work, you discover the guru actually possesses cybernetic enhancements and an artificially regulated metabolism.
You'd be furious.
You would immediately discard the plan. The guru's perfection is exactly what renders their system utterly worthless to you. The results aren't replicable for a standard biological body.
And that lack of replicability destroys the utility of the model. And Parwes uses this precise logic to launch a very sharp and historically controversial critique of the messenger's own later followers.
Okay, how so?
He examines how, centuries after the establishment of the system, poets, theologians, and writers of Naat, which is poetry dedicated to praising the messenger, began to heavily romanticize the historical figure. They progressively stripped away all of his human struggles.
They erased the sweat, the blood, and the terrifying uncertainty of those early years. They stopped focusing on the 82 grueling military campaigns, the periods of mass starvation, the agonizing tactical retreats, and the sheer human grit it required to build a functioning state from scratch.
Exactly.
Instead, they replaced the political reality with mythological miracle stories of flying to the heavens, communicating with animals, and bending the laws of physics.
And Parwes' critique of this romanticization is just devastating. He points out that by superhumanizing the leader, these well-meaning followers inadvertently agreed with the ancient Meccan elites.
Oh, wow, they fell into the same trap.
They fell backward into the exact same psychological trap. By elevating the historical leader to a godlike, magical status, someone who achieves political victory through supernatural intervention rather than meticulous socio-economic strategy, they conveniently excuse themselves from their responsibilities.
Because if the leader was magic,
then the modern followers don't have to do the difficult, dangerous work of confronting corrupt power structures and implementing rational laws in the real world today. They can simply sit in gatherings, sing praises to his magical nature, and allow their own societies to remain deeply corrupt and unequal.
that is a staggering sociological insight. By turning a revolutionary human reformer into a mythological superhero, you neutralize the structural threat he posed to the status quo.
You make him safe for the elites again.
You can have a deeply unjust society that simultaneously reveres the memory of the messenger, because the messenger has been removed from the realm of practical application. But this raises a critical historical question for us. If the text insists that he must be a normal guy, a bashar, to prove the system works, and if he absolutely wasn't performing magic tricks to win arguments, how did the opposition actually view his character?
Right.
If they couldn't attack his humanity because it was the proof of concept, what avenue was left to them?
Well, this brings us to the historical synthesis of our deep dive.
Yeah.
The reality of how the opposition viewed the messenger provides the final, undeniable proof of what this conflict was actually about.
Okay.
We often assume that the easiest way to shut down a political reformer is to simply expose them as a con artist.
Right, sure. Attack their credibility.
If the Meccan elites wanted to destroy his movement, all they had to do was prove he was a fraud who lied to the public. They didn't do that. Parwes draws our attention to a very specific, deeply revealing moment in the text, where the messenger is comforted regarding the opposition. The text explicitly states, "They are not calling you a liar, they are denying our laws."
They are not calling you a liar. They are denying our laws. We have to pause and analyze that distinction because it changes the entire geometry of the historical conflict.
It does.
It implies that the personal character of the messenger was entirely unassailable, even to the people actively trying to kill him.
It implies exactly that.
Yeah.
And Parwes cites a famous, highly documented historical event to provide the empirical proof for this claim. It involves Abu Sufyan.
Right, who for many years was the arch enemy of the messenger and the chief political and military leader of the Meccan opposition.
Yes. So in the year 628 CE, during a brief treaty period, Abu Sufyan traveled to the Levant for trade and found himself summoned to the court of the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius in Jerusalem.
The geopolitical context here is crucial. Heraclius has just won a massive, exhausting war against the Sassanid Persian Empire. He is trying to secure his southern borders. He has received a letter from this new political force in Arabia, and he wants intelligence. Abu Sufyan is highly motivated to secure Byzantine support, or at least neutrality, in his ongoing war against the messenger. If there was ever a moment to smear the reformer's reputation in front of a global superpower, this is it. Abu Sufyan has every incentive to call him a lying, scheming fraud.
But Heraclius is a sophisticated geopolitical operator. He doesn't ask for Abu Sufyan's emotional opinion. He conducts a structured interrogation about the sociological makeup of the movement and the background of its leader.
Like a cross-examination.
Exactly. One of the pivotal questions Heraclius asks concerns the messenger's life before he started preaching this new socio-economic system. He asks Abu Sufyan directly, "Did you ever accuse him of lying before he made these claims?"
And what does he say?
Abu Sufyan, the archenemy, is forced by the presence of his own fellow Meccan merchants, who would know if he perjured himself, to admit on the historical record that for 40 years prior to his mission, the messenger had a completely spotless, flawless track record of honesty and integrity among his people. They literally referred to him with titles denoting absolute trustworthiness.
Wow. So how does Heraclius process that data point? Because he isn't a theologian, he is an emperor analyzing a threat.
Heraclius applies basic, rational human psychology. He concludes that a man who meticulously protects his integrity, who never tells a single lie to secure an advantage against his fellow humans for 4 decades, does not suddenly wake up one morning in his 40s and invent a massive, complex, life-altering lie against the divine order.
It doesn't make logical sense.
Right. Heraclius recognized precisely what the text was stating. The elites knew the messenger was telling the truth. Their rejection was not born of intellectual doubt regarding his character. It was born of absolute, terrified economic self-interest.
So when we pull all of these threads together, the traditional narrative completely dissolves. We strip away the centuries of mystical interpretation. We stop looking at Surah Sad as an impenetrable code.
Yeah.
When we look at this text through the structural, empirical lens that Allama Parwaz provides, it transforms into an intensely relevant sociological document. The conflict in 7th century Mecca was never about personal character flaws. It was never about a philosophical debate over the metaphysical nature of invisible entities.
No, it was a brutal existential clash of systems.
Right. On one side, you have an entrenched elite desperate to maintain their mullah, their period of comfort. They are defending a fragmented, exploitative system, a bureaucracy of gatekeepers where wealth and power flow strictly to the top.
And when challenged, they justify their corruption through the ancestors' fallacy, weaponizing tradition to avoid reform.
Exactly. On the other side, you have the proposition of a rational, unified, egalitarian legal structure, a single system that flattens the bureaucracy. And crucially, this system is modeled by a normal, flawed, biological human being. The Bashar exists to prove unequivocally that it is physically and practically possible for us to implement equitable laws without needing supernatural intervention.
And the stakes of that clash are not isolated to ancient history, because, as the text outlines with the law of the period of respite, the consequences of ignoring the data are absolute.
They are inevitable.
If a society refuses to transition from an exploitative structure to a rational one, the result isn't a mystical punishment raining down from the clouds. It's the mathematical collapse of the civilization itself.
Right.
The ruins of Ad and Thamus aren't just ancient architecture. They are the future of any society that ignores the systemic alarms going off all around them.
That leaves us with a deeply provocative reality to consider as you step away from this deep dive. Look around at the massive systems of power you interact with every day. Your government institutions, the global economy, the massive corporate structures that dictate modern life.
The data is everywhere.
It is. When the people running those systems actively resist transparency and equity, when they appeal to sacred tradition or historical precedent to shut down necessary reforms, or when they elevate political founders and past leaders to godlike, unassailable mythological status.
You have to ask why.
Are they doing it because they genuinely want to inspire you to build a better world? Or are they doing it to convince you that their systemic failures, the widening wealth gaps, and the entrenched corruption are just the natural, unchangeable, divine order of the universe?
If history truly is an autopsy report, you have to look at the data in front of you and ask,
Yeah.
what structural warnings are we ignoring right now while we still have our period of respite?
Something to think about. We'll see you next time.